Thank you. Thank you, Stefan. Hello, everybody. Happy New Year. So we'll get right into it. So the presentation today is going to look at, I'm going to go through a kind of a short introduction into the framework and the model framework. I'd like to do a little bit of a demo to give people an idea of what it looks like and how to use it. Talk a little bit about the validation and the behavioral testing, and then move into some slides on how we can use MGM and I guess all growth models in forest management, and then I'll finish off with some concluding remarks here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the camera just because it'll make sure that things go a little bit smoother here. Okay, so if we look at MGM and we kind of talk about the things that how it's referenced, it's an individual tree distance independent model. And we'll be kind of coming in and out of this whole thought process of what an individual tree model is, what is distance independent, and how it works as we progress through the presentation. But I'm going to start off with talking about the data input. Okay. MGM is individual tree, therefore it's a tree list. And it can take measured TSPs or PSPs. The required data is usually, or is species, DBH, stems per hectare, density, height, breast height age, and total age. We can also simulate trees with the tree list generator. And this is an internal function. And if you provide a species, an average tree age, the density, an average height, standard deviation height, and an average DBH, and the standard deviation of the DBH, and on that list should be max height. You can generate a tree list for use, and we'll be actually using a tree list generated that way today in our demo. We need to use site index. We have to have climate moisture index, and we can specify the natural subregion, whether it's Alberta or the natural region, Alberta, actually the region, Alberta, BC, Saskatchewan, and then we can get into subregions, etc. And we also have the option to set up things like the merge criteria. Okay, so if we look at individual tree growth, I'm not going to get into, the goal here is not to get into the weeds of the model as far as function goes, but rather focus on how the model actually iterates through a tree list to make a projection. So in MGM, basically, growth is based on species, and then we split up the growth model or the growing functions into less than 4 centimeters, greater than equal 4 centimeters, and an old growth. And you can't really narrow it down to one function or one style of function for each of those categories. It varies because every species has different growth trajectories, and so we split them up, and all of them, even within those categories, are different. It's an annual time step. So MGM grows annually, although we report either on every 5-year interval or every 10-year interval when we use it to build something like a yield curve. Now, the individual tree list that's in MGM is sorted from largest to smallest by DBH. And this is important because of the way MGM works. It first does height increment. And so it is driven by site index. And this is the true top height site index, and by competition. So the top tree, which is the first tree in the list, grows at increment max, or its potential, which is basically right on the site index curve. Now, an annual time step is actually the difference between time 1 and time 1 or time 1 minus time 0. So it's actually going through and looking at a year, the year before, and subtracting to get the increment. Now, all other trees in the tree list actually are subordinate to the top tree, so they actually have competition from above. And so in MGM, as you go down the tree list, you get more competition. And the growth for height is adjusted by a reduction factor, which is relative to the amount of competition from above. Once the height increment is done, there's a diameter increment. And this is basically based on height increment and competition. Again, competition coming from above. At the next phase of annual growth of a single tree, mortality comes into play here. And it's based on DBH and competition. And at the end, MGM will look at the stand and its density and its size. And if the stand still is possessing too much density for a particular size, we invoke a maximum size density equation to begin to reduce the stand to where it is and where it's supposed to be. And this is based on, and I mean, the biggest use of this would be something like aspen, juvenile aspen that has 200,000 stems per hectare. And the mortality function can hack at that and adjust it, but it may not be aggressive enough. So we use the maximum size density equation to limit the growth or to limit the maximum density at any given time for the stand. Now, I'm going to spend some time here on this modeling competition in MGM. And this is kind of the basis part. Like the site index and the growth is pretty straightforward. But how does MGM actually grow trees, and how does it decide what the right increment is for every tree? So on the left part of this image, what you see is this. It's an aspen-dominated stand with understory spruce and maybe some intermediate. So we have dominant trees, we have intermediate trees of aspen and spruce, and then we have some suppressed trees. So as I mentioned earlier, in the tree list, the top tree is growing on site index. So these two large trees are going to be growing on site index. Now, the next tree, which would be maybe, let's say, this conifer, this spruce tree, it is second. And so it is overtopped by the other two trees, which are the aspen trees. Now, species is important here because aspen has a lighter crown compared to being overtopped by spruce, for example. So in this case, this spruce will be overtopped by aspen. And in MGM, the conifer, the aspen, and actually it's usually spruce fir, the aspen, and pine have 3 competition indices in it. And these coefficients are what we use to adjust the growth. So in this case, this spruce tree right here would have aspen over top of it. And it would be its growth, its height growth, diameter growth, and mortality would all depend on this single tree. Next to it is the aspen, so it's aspen over aspen, so it will be adjusted as well. And the third trees, these small spruce trees at the bottom, are shade-tolerant spruce, so they're quite happy to be there. They're not going to grow well or quickly because they're overtopped by the intermediate trees and the dominants. Now, the right slide has got to do more with the fact that suddenly we've got conifer over aspen. And so in this case, the dominant tree is a conifer, and its competitive effect on the other trees is greater because of A, it traps or blocks more light, and B, its utilization of the stand is different than, for example, the aspen in the left pane. So in MGM, the species, the size, and its distribution over the block density determines how trees grow. And it's done in a pecking order from the top down to the smallest. And so we refer to this all as vertical structure. And the reason MGM works is that for something like thinning, for example, when you remove a tree, you change all the competitive dynamics because all of the size and the competition variables for above it change, especially if you thin from above or you thin from below. So MGM basically grows trees based on the competition. Once you remove trees, whether it's from above or below, all that happens is MGM readjusts the competitive factors in it. Okay, so this is really important because as we go through the presentation, I'm open to present why MGM works as an individual tree model. So if we look at the inputs, now this is an actual tree list for MGM, and as we talked about, whether this is generated by the tree list generator or its input, it is this is, contains the majority of the values that are needed to run MGM. So we need to identify the stand. We have a stand ID. We specify the age of the stand. In this case, it's 13 years. The year is 2004. This really doesn't make much difference. It's for reference. We can talk about the region it's in this case, it's Alberta, and the natural subregion, which is central mixed wood. And we need to add a CMI or climate moisture index value. We have to provide it with the species that a species list, which is static to the 4 primary, white spruce, pine, aspen, and black spruce. And the pines, because they're mutually exclusive, can be jack pine or lodgepole pine, but never both, because we consider them growing in different regions. And then we need to provide a site index for each of those species. If you notice here on the left, you can see the years to breast height. That's calculated within MGM. The next part is the tree list, and we need to provide the species, the DBH, the height or the tree factor, which expands it from a plot to a per hectare value because MGM grows hectares. So in this case, there's 110 of this size tree in the block, and we have to provide it with a height. You'll notice that we've said that MGM needs a breast height age. It needs a breast height age and a total age. These are marked as a -1. And what that means is that there haven't been input yet. In MGM, once you start a simulation, these will get populated based on the size of the tree and the site index curve. And so we'll add the breast height age and the total age to the tree list when we run the crop plan. Also, you'll notice that there is a X and Y coordinate. Now, the X and Y coordinates are only for as visual aids because of the fact that we have a visualization routine, so we can specify where the coordinates. In no way is MGM a spatial model, which is actually using these coordinates. The other thing you need to notice on the tree list is that when I talked about earlier about competition, this 7.7 centimeter tree is the top tree. So it's going to grow on the site index curve. Okay, so I'm going to move into a demo. Okay, hopefully you can see the MGM screen. Okay, so when you open up MGM, you essentially come to what I refer to as the base or the distribution copy. And for this demo, I'm basically going to use MGM's standard demo copy once, just as you open it, and we'll build on that. Okay, so when you look at the screen, the first thing you have to understand is MGM modifies Excel to make it work. So at the top, you'll notice that there's an MGM tab. When you open up the tab, and we refer to this as the ribbon tab, you gain a whole bunch of MGM utilities, and these can be run from here or from drop-down menus over a crop plan. You'll also notice at the bottom that there is a crop plans worksheet, which we're on, a records worksheet, a yield table, charts, my charts, graphs, stands, and stand table. These are all tables that are used to store data as we run MGM. Okay, so MGM's divided. MGM's an interpreter. So what you're looking at here is, and if I select it, this is considered a crop plan. And a crop plan is a series of events. We identify the name of the crop plan. We have some options to set. We have some establishment events. We have a record, which writes to output to the records worksheet. We have a growth event and an end event. All crop plans begin with a crop plan event and end and an end event. So as I mentioned, MGM is an interpreter. It actually knows what's on the screen and it keeps track of everything. For example, the yellow line is the active line. If I right click over here, it moves it to the records line, and you can see that it brings up a drop-down menu. So I'm going to quickly just go through this standard distribution copy. So the first line, if you open it up and you go edit down here, you will see that I can edit the crop plan name. And this is important because we're going to be creating a bunch of crop plans in this session. And at that point, we're going to have a pretty good idea of how we can organize and sort different types of things that we want to do in a session. The options event, so I'm going to open that up and hit edit, specifies the region, the natural subregion. So in this case, it's Alberta, Central Mixedwood. We have an opportunity set merchantability criteria here. We can go into specifying on our outputs which species are of interest. So we can say we don't want birch in our outputs. We can remove birch from that. We have other settings, which is if you don't provide any site indices, we will substitute them with this. And just as a note over here, it's adjacency. This I'm going to make reference to in my presentation down the road. If we bring in a light model, I'm kind of leaving this as a placeholder. I would click here and set that. So this sets up what we refer to as the options. Okay, and if you note to the right, all of the options are actually placed into placeholders on the line. And so when I set MGM's an interpreter, it's actually going to read this line first, this, then it will go to the options, and then it'll go through all of the options and set them. And that is how MGM crop plans are actually executed. The next event is an establish event, and I'm going to edit that. And so if you open that up, what you basically see is two options. You can read the stand or read a tree list. So this will open up an opportunity to read a tree list that's actually, for example, a PSP plot, or in this case, it's a WESBOGY plot. Or you can create it with the tree list generator. And today's session, we're going to use a tree list generator. It makes it way more easy and more fun and flexible to edit things. So in this case, if we look down here, we see actually two species being generated. I can look at the aspen, and it's basically stating it's a tended stand. It's site index 24. It's got 4,425 stems per hectare, 13 years old. And then it has an average height, a standard deviation, max height, and a DBH, an average DBH, and a standard deviation on DBH. And so this is how you would specify a particular species in a tree list. So you can have as many of these species in the tree list, and they can be of the same species. They can be acknowledging different cohorts. For example, if you did something like a cutting and you have some regen or some suckering, you can actually bring back more different cohorts within a tree list. On the right-hand side, you'll notice you can have the stand ID. The stand weight is actually used for the multi-strata model, which we're not going to do today. We have the stand age at 13. We identify its year 2004, and here's where we would acknowledge or identify the climate moisture index. Now, if you want to edit this, you can edit it at will. We will be doing that. So at this point in time, I'm just going to say okay. Now it's telling me that I made changes, which I didn't, but I have to replace it and say okay to make sure that it's updated. And then here, if you pan over, you'll see, I don't know if this is that all of those values are now put into this. Here is the stand par list, which is actually the listing of all the trees that we are establishing in this stand. The next event is a record. Now you can't edit it, but all the record does is it says, now we've established the stand, can you write it out for me? I'd like to know what it looks like. So it is going to take the stand that's been created and it's going to write it to the records worksheet. Then the next one is the grow schedule. Is say we want to grow it, and if we open that up, it basically will tell you that the stand is 13 years old, and you have an opportunity to incrementally set the years that it's going to report at. And it'd be like saying that your yield table, you want it in 5-year intervals, 1-year intervals, you can have 10 years. Ours are set up at a 10-year interval. You can set it to whatever you want, as long as you want. It's really your choice. And the last event is an edit event. So to run MGM, you have a couple options. The most common one is you can use the ribbons. You can execute part of a cropland. Let's say I just wanted to execute to the establish event, so I wanted to just run that. So I'm going to use this functionality here because it's what I'm used to. I'm going to execute just to the establish event and including it. And what that allows me to do is to say, I want to see what this stand looks like. And so it goes through, it establishes it, and at this point, it will appear in the stand worksheet. And we've seen this before. So all of the values that we've set up in the options event and in the establish event come out here. Now, this top part is a summary of our options. We see the site indices and the species, and there's our tree list. And we can pan through. And so it's created basically the tree list that we specify we wanted. Both species are there, aspen and spruce. And this part right here is a calculated part. And this essentially means that it's taken the tree list data here, and these functions here are all, or these parameters are all calculated based on the tree list. Okay, So we haven't really even run it, right? So if we look at the stand, we still have no ages or anything. So executing the whole entire plan, I will right-click here, and I will execute the entire crop plan. And it's actually going to start at the bottom, and you can see it go item by item, row by row, and it's going to do the full projection. Now, I should have done limited the grow not to 200 years, but rather then limited it maybe to 120 or whatnot. But it's going to go to 200. And while it's doing that, I identify that in these two columns here, you'll see that MGM knows where everything is. It knows how long a growth schedule it is. It knows what we're doing all the time, and it keeps track of the stand age as well as the year items occur. Of course, this is all for our use to be able to visually see what exactly is going on. So the records worksheet, I'm going to go through the worksheets quickly. The records worksheet essentially goes through and tracks. It tells you which crop plan you ran, because we can have multiple. It summarizes the tree list for you. There's the yield table that comes out. And because we never specified a record at the end of the projection, the only record is at this point. If we go to the yields, we have a worksheet with the yields at 10-year intervals as we requested. Again, it can be 5 years and whatnot. If we look at the graphs, I'm going to just make this a little bit bigger. What we can see is that one of the outputs is looking at the volumes, for example, and it breaks it up by conifer, deciduous or softwood, hardwood, and all. And there's the volume charts and trajectories for this particular stand. Similarly, here are the MAIs. We can look at the densities and the total densities. The difference between density and total density is always all the trees. This has a merge criteria, which we never specified. It was 0, 0. Basal area and average DBH and so on. The other one is that we can look at is my charts. And this is what I consider the common one I look at. Essentially, you've got conifer on the left side panes and the deciduous, and you have conifer volume and deciduous volume at the top. And then we can go down to the MAIs and the basal areas, and then we have average diameters, sorry, those are average heights, average top heights, DBHs, and densities, and total densities. So all of these inputs are being generated by reviewing the yield tables and that information. So essentially, a lot of the information that people need is here. Always, we send everything to the records worksheet, and in the end, there's a utility on the website that's called the records extractor. It will extract all of the yields and the tree lists and put them in a separate worksheet for your use to bring it into SAS or an R or whatever. Okay, so we come back into the crop plans worksheet, and I'm just going to try to demonstrate quickly here. So I'm going to select the stand, and I'm going to make a duplicate of it. And so again, you'll see that MGM has to work through the fact that it now has 2 crop plans. Hence, this is a crop plans worksheet, plural, and these are crop plans. So what I'd like to do here, and I want to make sure I want to check my time here, and what I want to do is give you just one quick snippet at how we may be able to use this. So in this case, what I'd like to do is I'm going to go edit the crop plan event, and I want to know what would be the effect if we switched around the site indices for this. So in this case, the aspen site indices is 24, and I'm going to change that to 20. I'll replace it, and I'll say OK. And actually, I should set the other one too. We'll go edit, and we'll look at the spruce, and it's at 20. I'm going to set this to 24, and I can replace that, and I can say OK. And now what I want to do is I want to contrast the two runs. Now this is the distribution copy. I'm just going to edit the name here, and I'm going to edit the event, and I'm going to call that switch SI. Say OK. And so it's named. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to execute all the crop plans in this crop plans worksheet. So it's going to go through, and it's going to run the first one, and it's going to run the second one. And all of the outputs that we've requested are going to be placed in the records worksheet, but they're also going to display in the chart. So what we're asking here is a simple question. If the site indices of these plots switched, what would be the outcome? And so it's finishing up the first crop plan. And now it's on to the second one. So my point here is that this isn't really difficult to build crop plans and run them. And I'm gonna, once this one is done, I'll show you all the options that you can, the things that you can do. If I had more time, I could do a thinning, I could do a regen event, I can do a commercial thinning versus say a pre-commercial thinning. All of that is available within MGM. So it's finished doing, or just finishing up here. Okay, it's done, and I'm just going to go to my charts, which is going to get, be updated here. Now, when you look at this, and again, I can't spend too much time on this because, but the key here is the red one was the switched. So you'll see that the conifer clearly became dominant because of the fact that we made it a site index 24, and in the aspen switch down because we switched down. And so anything that you do within MGM will be shown. So if you do a thinning, you'll see the drops in the volume and so on. So it's not very hard to generate some pretty interesting crop plans. And the only, before I kind of end this session, this part of the demo, I'd like to just to show you the events that you have choices to insert. I'm actually going to move down here. And if I insert an event, some of these you're already going to see and understand or recognize: the crop plans, the establish, we've talked about the grow. The harvest is worth noting, and I'll come back to that one. There's the options event, there's the record event, and then there's a regen event, which allows you to add, after a harvest, for example, you can add a species back at some density and size. Stop, you can do a thin, and then the visualize is the one that we used in order to create a visualization. You'll see some of those in the presentation as we proceed. But I do want to open up a harvest. Just to give you an idea, we have opportunities when we harvest to specify the species. We can specify a tagging limit. We can specify a removal rule. The smallest first, smallest diameter, largest. So you can choose how to thin. At the bottom, I believe, let me see here. Proportional would be something like a herbicide, where it's going to randomly take a bit of all the trees. And then the removal rules, you can see that you can remove fixed densities, percentages, basal areas, and you can essentially build a crop plan around establishing a stand, growing it, harvesting it, regenerating it, growing it some more, harvesting it, regenerating it, and you can be specific to species, and you can be specific to at timing. All of that is open to you when you build a crop plan. So it's very, very flexible. Okay, so I'm going to move on. I'd love to spend more time here, but I'm going to move on a little bit, kind of changing gears. MGM is now approved for use in Alberta by the Alberta Government. And so we went through a fairly long and rigorous testing of MGM, and I can't go through and talk about MGM without really appreciating the amount of work that's gone into getting it to work and work well. And I wanted to just cover off some of the things that we did to get approval. So in this whole phases and the different phases of approval, which was several iterations, the government went through and they did an internal review and their testing of the model. They reviewed the documentation. They reviewed the best practices document. They asked us to prepare validation reports, and they reviewed the results there. They looked at behavioral results, whether this was from PSPs or from treeless generated data that would reflected the RSA, for example, types of stands. So in the validation, again, I'm not going to go through a whole bunch of these. I just want to give you one idea of, or one example of what a validation is. So this is a comparison of observed to predicted. The dashed line refers to the one-to-one line. If the model was perfect, all of the points would be along that line. So what we look for is bias. Is the model leaning one way or the other way? And in this case, this is coniferous volume, and it's all the plots. There are 2,600 plots. The average model bias is 13 cubic meters, and it's positive, which means that it's an underestimate. And the average model bias is about 16, or the relative model bias is about 6.5%, which basically says the model tends overall, over all conifer species, to underestimate by about 13 or 6.5%. Now, this is done, was done for the Piggy data set, and it was also done for the Saskatchewan data set. Now, we did the categories. We did the broad cover groups, we did all the species individually, and then we did the cover groups by species. All of these tests are to see whether or not there is any particular area where there is a bias, and you're really evaluating model performance. Now, the variables, in addition to the volume, we split it into conifer and deciduous, and then we did volume, basal area, mean height, mean DBH, top height, and density. So there's a lot of data being generated, and this is again with real PSP data. So we initialize MGM with time 1, and in 15, in some cases 40 years later, we contrasted the MGM projected to the observed data. And that's what these scatter plots demonstrate. And it really was the foundation for our model development. also did behavioral testing. And now these were long-term projections to age 200. And this whole part was asking, does the model behave biologically well? And is it reasonable? And so we did this with the PIGGY data in Alberta, the RLP, and the WESBOGY data. We split it up into the conifer and deciduous. This is an aspen example. We have age on the x-axis. We have merchantable volume on the right. We took all the PSPs and ran them out to age 200, and then we fit a yield curve to it. Essentially, these are nonlinear fits, so these would be essentially the yield curve for a strata, for example, if that's what you were looking at doing. What we're actually wondering was, are there bad behaving plots? You can see in the aspen, you have some plots up here that are starting at age, looks like about 25 with 600 cubic meters of volume, and that's just not realistic. So this is an age issue, but it doesn't matter because it's a data issue, not an MGM issue. But in general, you can see, does MGM, is it plausible? Is it realistic? Are maximum yields reasonable? And through that whole process of approval, all of these had to get tweaked and worked through until everything was behaving well. Okay, the next thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was the batch processing. So you saw that we're doing in the RSA matrix that we ran, we did 11,000 plus plots. And so I wanted just to highlight what the batch processing, how it works in MGM. So we've created a crop plan. We create a batch control list. And now all this is all of the fields we want to exchange or change in here are listed in here. And all computer programs that are running batch use this kind of approach. Then we have what's called the batch macro, in which what it happens is we say in column 1 of here is the crop plan ID. So go to the crop plans or the control list, take it, bring it in here, put it into that place, go grab the next one. One row gets populated in the crop plans worksheet, and we go through the last phase, which is to run it. So essentially, it reads the batch control list, it updates the crop plan, it runs the crop plan, saves the output to a yields worksheet and a tree list worksheet, and then goes to the next record in the batch control list and does it all over again. The key thing with this is that it is so flexible that you can create any kind of crop plan because you can add records and things, so you can control exactly what you want to alter. You can build whatever kind of crop plan you want, and the key is you will be able to do a batch processing with it. Okay, so some slides on the use of MGM in forest management. So the main one is annual cut calculations or creating yield curves for annual allowable cut determination. So we're really looking at future yield trajectories. Because of MGM structure, you can model naturals, natural stand development. You can manage, model managed stands, and you can use it for tended and things like understory protection, all because, and I relate back to that competition, MGM doesn't need to know that it's a cut block. All it needs to know, or a thinning, it just needs to know what's growing out there and what's the pecking order of all the trees. That's the basis for MGM. Another thing that you may be able to look at is something like successional, and I'll show an matrices. I'll show an example of that in a bit. Now, we also can do things like gaming. We just did some gaming when we looked at the demo. For example, you can do risk analysis on site indices, and that's what we did. You can do commercial thinning at different ages to see where's the sweet spot. You can play with species mixtures. You can play with densities, site indices, ecoregions. You can look at a lot of different things because MGM allows you to build whatever you want. And then the other one is, now let's say we do have a system that we've got in place. I would like to be able to build a yield curve or mimic and see what the future outcomes of these types of treatments are going to be. We can do that in MGM as well. So yield curves, we've seen this graph already, but this is the white spruce trajectories. We basically took the 635 PSPs that were identified as pure white spruce. We projected them all out, and we fit a yield curve to it. This is the aspen component, and this is the total. So this is how you would build a yield curve if you used MGM. The other thing is to look at is Mixedwood dynamics, and I'm just going to check my time here. Oh boy. Okay, let's do this quickly. Silviculture systems, understory protection. You can see the strip cuts here. In MGM, you can take a stand at time 1. You can impose a harvest, and this is strip cuts. So this is the machine corridor. You reach left, you reach right, you remove all the aspen, you leave a reserve block. And you project it out to the future, in this case, age 144. And you basically get the results. Now, as far as building yield curves for that, each of those strata have a separate area. So, and each projection will give you its conifer and deciduous component. Then this is the conifer component. You can actually create a weighted curve based on the areas. So in this case, the extraction is 70%. The reserve is 10%, and the purple, we've got also the gold, which is the reserve, and the weighted is the machine corridor, the purple, and which would have no conifer. The point is, the summation of all of this would be your yield curve for conifer from this particular treatment. We can model it as avoidance. You have the reserve around, the machine comes in, it reaches in, pulls out all of that. We can model that in MGM as well. We can model different types of treatments, for example, pulse spray. So this is one area in which a boom on a helicopter with a sprayer was on and went off and on, created a checkerboard. Here is the MGM projections of that. And you see the key thing is that I've referenced adjacency. MGM has a multi-strata model, which was used for the strip cut. It also has a light component. Now, this light component was this part of MGM basically says, in this machine corridor over here, light is being blocked by the sides. How much? The less light, the less growth. So the more light, the more growth. So MGM has the capacity. It uses what's called mixed light, which was developed by Ken Stat and Vic Liefers, and it's an adaptation of this. Ken had this, I'm giving all the credit here to Ken for this, but what it does is it goes down, it looks on each side of the stand and determines whether or not how much light is being actually cast or available for trees in there. Conifer, 6 meter tall, conifer 10 meter tall, conifer 20 meter tall on each side will all cast different shade on the area and the light availability. And what that does is it allows MGM to adjust it. We did a study with Gitta Grover, and which we demonstrated the impact. And here on the right at the bottom, it was the impact of using the light model. The black line is assuming it was a clear cut with no competition around it. On the checkered line or the dashed line was the impact using the light model. So you can see the impact on that. We can also look at, because it's a tree list, we can look at the effect of the control versus the extraction corridor on piece size. This is important. By doing something like understory protection, you're going to see a shift to the right in piece size because of the release of the spruce once you remove the aspen from over top. And here also you can see the yield bump by doing understory protection. Matrices, successional matrices. Along the top is the hardwoods, on the softwood densities on the left. This is done by Lane Gellhorn. This is really cool. You project out all the different combinations and you can build the broad cover groups, and you can see at what densities at RSA time at age 13 are going to, what are they going to be when they grow up? Are they going to be C, CD, B, C, Ds? And this is a novel use of a model and MGM. I make reference to the MGM website, which is mgmualberta.ca. You can get the model there. You have the documentation, best practices. There's the research notes. There's a series of tutorial videos on how to use MGM. There's a new added layer or a utility called the raster layer, the CMI raster layer. This has just been posted within the month. And basically, because CMIs are difficult to obtain, because you need lat long elevation, and then you have to go through a process, this is now an ArcGIS layer where you can just provide the lat long and it'll give you the CMI estimate for that area. Additionally, all the utilities like the CMI solver, the batch macro, the records extractor, and the make stands are all available there. So in closing, so the model was developed to help forest managers test and use, have a tool to test different management practices. It can develop really complex stands and mimic very complex systems, including silvicultural systems. And you can use the spatial, the multi-strata model to mimic the spatial structure to some degree, pseudo-spatial. The internal relationships are been developed so that you can grow varying mixtures of species and stand structures and get realistic results. It validates well for Alberta and Saskatchewan. Opportunities are to do more validation are always a good thing. Continued development could further improve MGM. I guess that was the last point, is that it shouldn't stop here. We should continue to develop MGM. It's got great capabilities. At this point, I just would like to thank the Western Boreal Growth Association, the project team, and the Mixedwood project team, FRIA, the GOA, Saskatchewan Ministry, the U of A, and I do have to acknowledge Steve Titus, Bill Adams, Phil Como, Ken Statt, Kirk Johnson, and all the grad students that have had their fingers in MGM one way or another. With that, will conclude my presentation.